Thanks for joining me as we continue our story.
Later. I was just interrupted in my writing, but it was a pleasure, as a deck steward served me a hot mug of broth. I cannot get over how delightful it is to have people bring you things, even without being asked. The liquid tastes beefy and rich, full of goodness from the marrow. I expect to be quite stout when this voyage is over. Shortly before noon, Mrs. Carstairs and I went along with the general flow of passengers heading for the upper decks. Florence remained behind, sleeping on Mrs. Carstairs' canopy bed. Instead of taking a lift this time, we climbed what I already heard people calling the Grand Staircase. It was, unquestionably, a very impressive piece of architectural artistry. Broad mahogany steps winding upwards with a dome-shaped glass skylight above. A statue of a cherub holding a light aloft graced the middle railing, and a beautifully carved wooden clock with a pair of intricately detailed figures dominated the wall at the top of the landing. The time read 11:50. The railings up on the boat deck were so crowded that we could find no place to stand. We moved down to B deck and found a small open space along the promenade. I felt a shiver of excitement each time the steam whistles blew, trumpeting our departure. The air seemed to fill with a sense of tremendous anticipation. Below us, the quay was also jammed by an enthusiastic crowd of people waving their handkerchiefs or hats and shouting farewells. In return, our passengers were also waving and tossing single flowers or even full bouquets over the side. Some splashed into the water, while others were caught by lucky onlookers. I'm sure I will never be able to forget that feeling of shared festivity and jubilation. The Titanic is such a large ship that a group of tugboats had been assembled to tow us away, out into Southampton water. As we began to move ever so slightly, a tremendous cheer rose up. There were other boats berthed nearby, and their passengers and crew members were waving at us too. Out of nowhere came several sharp cracking sounds. I was afraid part of the ship had broken apart, but then I saw a smaller ship break free of its mooring ropes and veer in our direction. It looked as though she might crash right into us. Some of the people by the railing didn't even notice, while others gasped. The Titanic did not seem able to turn out of the way in time, but then a wave of water slowed the other ship, and one of the tugboats steered it to safety. An Englishman standing a few feet away from us said, "Well, what can you expect from a ship called the New York?" Mrs. Carstairs was not the only American nearby who did not laugh at this. My fellow Brits, though, were almost uniformly amused. There was something of a delay as the New York was secured, and I heard people grumble about being thrown off schedule. To me it seemed a minor mishap, and hardly worth complaining about. I was merely relieved that an incident had been averted. Two men behind us were talking seriously about the huge wake a ship like the Titanic created, simply by moving her bulk through the water, and how anything in her path would be helpless in the face of that suction. As she tends to be so nervous, I would have expected Mrs. Carstairs to become extremely upset about our near miss, but she was chatting casually with the woman on her left and discussing mutual acquaintances, of which they seemed to have many. We were under way now, but other than that, a slight sense of engines throbbing somewhere far below me, I could barely feel the ship's motion. Since I had been dreading a constant bobbing and lurching, this smooth and gentle pace came as a relief. A bugle began trumpeting so close to us that I jumped. It was being played by a man in a crisp blue uniform with brass buttons. All around me almost everyone began to move away from the railings and head back inside. "Come along now, Margie J," Mrs. Carstairs said briskly. "Time for our luncheon." From this I gathered that it was routine for the sound of a bugle to announce meals. This was far preferable to the forceful banging on tin pots I had heard so many times during my childhood. It is also routine on board to call the midday meal luncheon and the evening meal dinner. Margie J. Do all Americans have a penchant for misbegotten nicknames, or is it just Mrs. Carstairs? A vulgar habit to my way of thinking. Then I heard another American lady up ahead of us happily greeting someone else by shouting, "Bootsy, how are you?" Bootsy? God save us from the colonies. The first-class dining saloon was on D deck. We waited in a crush of people for a lift and then rode downstairs. There was a large, inviting reception room in front of us, and a small band was playing off to one side. I did not recognise the tune, but it was very cheery. The reception room was filled with wicker chairs surrounded by small round tables and an array of large reedy plants that had been placed in strategic locations. It struck me as a cosy place to linger. The dining saloon itself ran the full width of the ship and seemed even longer. The room looked as if it could easily serve 100 people, and yet the small, elegant tables had somehow an intimate feel. The ceilings curved into detailed mouldings and were supported here and there by thin white columns. A plush patterned carpet covered the floor, and the tall frosted windows made it seem as though we were anywhere but aboard a ship. It was not my place to take the initiative, so I sat in the chair Mrs. Carstairs indicated. It had a solid feel, with sturdy oaken arms and legs and a medium green upholstery. At least 2 people my size could have fitted in the seat, and I felt rather young and small perched on its edge. If I were not careful, I feared I might slide right off. It was a chair designed to comfort the corpulent, I suspected. The tablecloths were white, and a small lamp with a dark red shade sat in the middle of the table as a centrepiece. A napkin was folded like a pair of wings on the top of each plate, and accompanied by a daunting array of glassware and cutlery. Sister Catherine had always advised me to mimic whatever the most mannerly person at the table seemed to be doing, and I can only hope that that will carry me through. Our table seated 6, and shortly we were joined by a Mr. and Mrs. Prescott, whom Mrs. Carstairs was delighted to see. She introduced me in the briefest possible way, and then they were off in energetic conversation about the spring fashions, the delight of the Russian ballet, and an endless stream of people I did not know and places to which I had never been. Even if I had felt bold enough to participate in the conversation, I would have nothing to contribute to these topics. The Prescotts were pleasant to me, but expressed great disappointment that Mr. Carstairs had been unable to make the voyage. Mrs. Carstairs concurred, and they began to speak of Broadway and the West End and other theatrical subjects. Bangers and mash would have done me nicely, but our luncheon was far more impressive than that, with multiple courses. I elected not to drink any wine, and satisfied myself with water instead. A cold potato soup, salmon, tiny spring peas, crisp asparagus with a tart dressing, roast meat, a stream of black-jacketed waiters bearing silver platters appeared at our table again and again. I generally prefer the heartier taste of mutton, but my sliced lamb was delicious. For that matter, everything, right down to the fruit tart and array of cheeses and fruits we were offered for dessert, was delicious. After our meal, I was ready for a bit of a lie down myself, so I was pleased when Mrs. Carstairs suggested returning to our cabins. In our absence, her flowers had been arranged, and there was even a bouquet of yellow daffodils in my room. Our clothing had also been unpacked and the luggage stowed away. "Fairies came to visit her," I said. Mrs. Carstairs laughed. "Oh, child, it is quite customary." An enchanting custom, I should say. The washstand has been well supplied with thick towels and small scented soaps. After a mite of freshening up, I lay on my bed for a time, marvelling once again at how I could scarcely tell that the ship was moving. Even the hum of the engines had begun to seem familiar, and not loud enough to be oppressive. Just after 3, according to the small clock in my room, when I went to take Florence for a walk, and ultimately ended up here on the promenade, lounging on a deck chair. Yet another steward even brought me a steamer rug to tuck about my legs so I would not get chilled. I've been sitting here writing for a while, then pausing to watch people stroll by. A number of children have been playing on the deck, tended to by governesses for the most part, as well as the occasional parent. The children have tops and marbles and other small toys too numerous to mention. Except for 1 or 2 stormy bouts of tears, they all seem to be having a happy afternoon. Part of me would like to go over and join in, but as a hired companion, I do not suppose I am permitted to engage in childish pursuits on this trip. One point a ball rolled over in my direction, and I tossed it back to the boy who owned it. Even though he was probably only a year or 2 younger than I am, he just said, "Thank you, miss," and raced off to continue his game. I cannot help feeling a bit left out. Too old to play with the children, and too young and naive to interact with the adults. In these fancy clothes, I can pass for one of them, but, to me, the differences in our social backgrounds feel too huge to overcome. I suppose I should have a driving desire to examine the ship from top to bottom, but so far, I'd rather adjust gradually to being here. There'll be plenty of time for exploration in the days to come. But now I think Florence could do with stretching her small legs, so I'll write more later. Thanks for listening and I'll see you tomorrow.